The garden party that ended too soon CHAPTR won the annual Bologna Lane Garden Society fete had begun, as always, with a fanfare of clinking teacups and the chatter of 100 polite voices. The day was unseasonably warm for late August, with sunlight spilling across the lawns like golden syrup. Beneath the stretched canvas of a cream marquee, plates of Victoria sponge, rhubarb tarts, and ginger biscuits sat temptingly beside urns of tea and pitchers of pale elderflower cordial. Children with sunburned noses ran shrieking through the orchard path, while older villagers fanned themselves discreetly with folded programs. Miss Marple, ensconced in a wicker chair with a floral cushion of faded roses, observed it all with quiet attentiveness. She wore a pale blue cardigan despite the heat and held a napkin-wrapped slice of seed cake that remained largely untouched. Her eyes, pale and sharp as cornflowers, drifted from face to face with the subtlety of a sparrow pecking at crumbs, never appearing to stare, and yet missing nothing. This year, the fete was hosted by the Harcourts, whose ivy-laced house stood just beyond the churchyard wall. They had gone to great lengths, as Mrs. Harcourt never failed to remind people, to ensure that the garden looked its best. The hydrangeas had bloomed early, the rose bush had been dead-headed with almost fanatical precision, and even the gravel on the garden path had been freshly raked. But despite the perfection of the setting, there was a certain undercurrent to the day's gathering, something brittle behind the smiles. Miss Marple had noticed it from the moment she arrived. Her gloved hand resting lightly on the iron gate at the entrance, the gate that usually swung shut with a brisk click, but today had hung open, its latch gently tapping the post in the breeze. "It's that gardener of theirs," whispered Miss Hartnell, who had taken a seat beside Miss Marple and was nibbling a macaron with squirrel-like urgency. "Harcourt pays him far too much to be so lax. A good gate doesn't just not close." "Jane," Miss Marple murmured something indistinct. Her attention had shifted to a striking young woman standing beside the refreshment table, Mrs. Leslie Adams. Nee Lovett was dressed in a flowing lavender frock, her honey-blonde hair pinned high beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She laughed easily, though it did not quite reach her eyes, and played the perfect hostess, refilling teacups and straightening tablecloths with practiced ease. Her husband, Terence Adams, stood beside her, taller by a head and dark in contrast. He was a man of quiet reserve, often mistaken for haughty by those who didn't know him well. Few in St. Bede's did. He had only lived in the village 3 years, and though impeccably mannered, he never seemed quite to belong. There was something watchful in him, like a cat poised at a windowsill too still to be at ease. "They do make a handsome pair," Miss Hartnell said, her eyes narrowed as she watched Leslie brush something invisible from Terence's lapel. "But not happy, I shouldn't think, not truly. She was engaged to that solicitor once, Gerald something or other. A pity she let him go." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. It was not the first time she had heard the story. Gerald Beckwith, a junior partner at the Market Dean Law Offices, had seemed an excellent match, steady, affable, comfortably dull. And yet Leslie had broken it off abruptly 2 summers ago, shortly after Terence arrived to lease the Garthside cottage. Rumors, of course, abounded. As the sun moved westward and the raffle prizes were announced to polite applause, the crowd began to thin near the orchard. The air grew close and bees bumbled lazily among the dahlias. It was at that moment, just before the judging of the best rose bloom, that a shriek pierced the hum of conversation. It came from behind the refreshments table, near the path that led to the old summer house. All heads turned. A flurry of motion followed as young Emily Carstone, barely 16, in a pink dress too frilly for the occasion, staggered out from behind the trellis. Her gloved hands were raised, and one bore a dark, wet smear. Her face was chalk pale. "There's a man, he's dead. Blood, oh so much blood." At once the garden dissolved into commotion. Mrs. Harcourt screamed and dropped her prize begonias. Mr. Pettigrew, the retired schoolmaster, barked for everyone to stay calm. Several men rushed toward the summer house, among them Mr. Harcourt and Gerald Beckwith, who had come late to the fete and looked suddenly ashen. Miss Marple rose without haste and followed at a distance, pausing only to set down her napkin. In the old wooden summer-house, nestled between overgrown rosebush and a leaning sundial, lay Terence Adams, his body slumped sideways on the bench, a dark stain spreading across his linen jacket from a jagged wound just below the left ear. A small gardening trowel lay on the ground nearby, innocent, yet too near to be ignored. There was a long silence. Then someone whispered, "Murder." By the time Inspector Crisp arrived, driving too fast in his dusty Morris Minor and muttering about the fate being not his idea of a peaceful Sunday, the scene had been cordoned off with bits of bunting and overturned deck chairs. He was a ruddy-cheeked man with a tidy mustache and a fondness for making notes in his little black book. As he questioned the witnesses in brisk succession, Miss Marple sat nearby, quietly knitting the beginnings of what looked like a baby's sock. "Who found the body?" the inspector asked. "Emily Carstone, sir," answered Mr. Harcourt. "Poor girl's been sick into a rhododendron. And who last saw Mr. Adams alive?" "I believe it was Leslie, his wife. She says he left to get some air about 15 minutes before the scream." The inspector scribbled furiously. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "And the trowel?" she asked gently. "May I see it?" Inspector Crisp blinked. "Not advisable, Miss Marple. There may be evidence." "I don't intend to touch it. I only wonder if it's one of the Harcourt set. It would matter whether the weapon was at hand or brought with intent." He frowned, then knelt to inspect the tool. After a long pause, he muttered, "This doesn't match." "The set on the rack outside the potting shed. Different handle." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "How interesting," she murmured. "And the garden gate, was it open when you arrived?" "The front one? Yes, but what of it?" "It usually closes on its own, Mrs. Harcourt. Had it fixed last spring. She's rather proud of that hinge. I dare say someone forgot to latch it." "Perhaps. But people forget for reasons, Inspector. Often very good ones." The villagers began to drift home under a shroud of whispers. The fate was ruined. The Harcourts retreated indoors. Mrs. Harcourt, now revived with a sherry and smelling salts, was reportedly weeping into a doily. The Adams house, locked by the police, stood silent across the lane. Leslie Adams, her pale face framed in shadows, sat motionless near the birdbath, still in her lavender dress. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she neither wept nor spoke. Miss Marple noted how no one approached her. Even the vicar's wife merely hovered nearby, unsure of what comfort to offer. Miss Marple studied the young widow's profile. Composure can be a kind of scream, she thought, and silence, a confession not yet spoken. That evening after supper, at the vicarage, Inspector Crisp accepted a second cup of tea from the Reverend's wife and sighed heavily. No fingerprints on the trowel, no witnesses. It looks like he was struck from behind. Might have been robbery, but nothing's missing. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "And yet the gate was open." "Yes, you mentioned that before. Things that usually work but fail when they are needed often point the way, Inspector." He looked puzzled, then waved his hand. "Let's not chase red herrings." But Miss Marple only smiled faintly and turned to the window, where twilight had settled over the rooftops like a silk shawl. Somewhere in the dark an owl called once, soft and distant. By Monday morning, St. Bede's was a village in a state of contained uproar. No sirens had pierced the quiet night, no search parties trampled the hedgerows, and no outsider journalists had yet descended with flashing cameras. Still, for those who had lived in the parish for decades, as most had, this was upheaval enough to last a lifetime. The last murder had been some 37 years ago, and it had involved poisoned jam and a contested will. This, however, was blood and violence, right in the Harcourt summer house at a village fete no less. There were whispers of it having happened right under the noses of a dozen witnesses. To some, it was terrifying. To others, it was thrilling. Mrs. Nettle, who ran the post office, could hardly keep up with the foot traffic. She passed more tea tins than stamps that day. Every customer lingered to speculate. "Walked right into the summer house, she did," said Mr. Huxley, the baker, thumping a floury hand on the counter. "Emily Carstone. Poor girl saw him laid out like something from a penny dreadful. Blood everywhere, they say. Not just blood. He was slumped, said Mrs. Chalmers, whose knowledge of posture extended primarily to flower show presentations. Slumped, not lying down. That means he sat there for a while before anyone found him. And that trowel, muttered the Reverend's wife, who had stopped by for barley sugar but now clutched it forgotten. So clean. Isn't it odd? No smudges, no fingerprints. As if someone wore gloves, offered Mr. Huxley. Darkly, Miss Marple, for her part, made no contribution to the post office gossip mill. Instead, she spent the morning gently weeding her front garden. She wore an old straw hat with a faded blue ribbon. And though she seemed preoccupied with a stubborn patch of dandelions, her mind wandered to more elusive roots. She had spoken briefly to Leslie Adams the evening before. Or rather, she had spoken near her. Leslie had answered little only, nodding and murmuring that she felt tired and couldn't quite believe it. But Miss Marple had noted the way her eyes flicked toward the Adams cottage more than once, not with grief, exactly, but with something else, uncertainty. Wariness, perhaps. There had been something troubling in that gaze. By midday, Inspector Crisp returned to the village. His Morris Minor pulled up outside the police post on Dovecote Lane, and the villagers watched as he emerged, tie slightly skewed, expression grim. A small crowd had already begun to form outside the vicarage where Leslie Adams had taken temporary refuge. Miss Marple noticed them as she passed on her way to return a library book. Mrs. Carmichael, the greengrocer's sister, lingering near the hedge, and old Mr. Dowd pretending to adjust his bicycle chain while keeping a keen ear open. Inside the vicarage, the inspector's interview with Leslie was private. She had requested her solicitor none other than Gerald Beckwith. That, too, had tongues wagging. "Rather quick to call for a lawyer," muttered Miss Hartnell over tea. "And Gerald her former fiancé, mind you, what must that look like?" Miss Marple simply stirred her tea. "It's often the people closest to the situation who offer help, and Mr. Beckwith has always been a level-headed sort." "He's not married," Miss Hartnell added, almost defensively. "Still pines for her, I imagine." Miss Marple smiled gently but said nothing. That afternoon, a curious bit of information made its way around the lanes and over garden walls. Terence Adams had been in some sort of dispute. "Something to do with land," Mr. Pettigrew confided to the vicar. "He wanted to purchase the strip behind the Harcourt's garden, but there was disagreement about the boundary lines. Got quite heated, I'm told." "I heard he was planning to build on it," said Miss Blount, who had been known to embellish with enthusiasm. "A greenhouse or a guest cottage. Some said he wanted to turn it into a rental." Mrs. Harcourt was livid. "Well, now she's traumatized," said the Reverend's wife briskly. "She dropped a whole decanter of sherry when I asked her about it. A whole decanter." Miss Marple's ears pricked slightly at that. Not at the sherry, but at the idea of building. She remembered something Terence had once said at the village quiz night 2 months earlier. "Growing things from the ground up, that's real work," he'd said, half laughing. "Unlike marrying into it." Leslie, seated beside him, had gone very still. That evening, Emily Carstone was invited to tea at the vicarage, a kind attempt to restore her spirits. Miss Marple was also present, and the conversation, while light at first, gradually veered toward the event. "I only went behind the table to get the trellis scissors," Emily said, pushing crumbs across her plate. "Mrs. Harcourt said they were kept near the potting bench, and I thought I'd be helpful." "You were," said the vicar's wife warmly. Emily's fingers trembled slightly. "When I saw him, he was leaning forward. His hand was still open, like he'd dropped something. I didn't see anyone leave, but the gate was swinging." "I remember that." Miss Marple's teacup paused midway to her lips. "Swinging? Yes," Emily said. "Like someone had just passed through. I thought maybe it was wind, but it didn't feel like it. It felt like I just missed someone." After Emily left, Miss Marple remained behind, sitting quietly as the dusk gathered. "A killer who walks away," she said softly, "leaves more than footprints. He leaves a moment of silence, a beat too late, and sometimes a gate ajar." The following day, Inspector Crisp came to call. "I've just come from questioning the Harcourts again," he said, taking the offered scone but not eating it. Nothing new except they mentioned a quarrel last week, Mr. Adams and someone in the garden. Oh? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. They didn't see who but heard raised voices. The Harcourts thought it might have been Gerald Beckwith, but he denies it. Of course, said Miss Marple quietly. And Leslie? She insists she was with. Guests all afternoon. And it holds up, mostly, still odd, isn't it? No signs of a break-in, no robbery, no motive we can pin. Miss Marple nodded, looking out the window. The church bell chimed faintly in the distance. There was a motive, she said, almost to herself, but it's not what it looks like. She turned back, her expression mild. And I suppose the Adams house is still locked? Until the coroner gives permission. Miss Marple stirred her tea. When you do enter, Inspector, do look to see if anything has been moved on the writing desk. Letters, drafts. Even, I rather think the answer is already written, only not where we expect to find it. As Inspector Crisp left, puzzled once more, Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to her rosebed. The buds were late this year, but then some things took time to bloom. She reached for her gloves, her thoughts slowly arranging themselves like petals in place. A quarrel, a swinging gate, an open hand, a clean trowel, and a woman who didn't cry. Things were beginning to grow. But before one could harvest a truth, one had to gently pull away all the weeds. Chapter 2 *. The morning after Inspector Crisp's visit passed with deceptive quiet. The village of St. Bede's, awash in the pale light of late summer, seemed determined to resume its rhythm. Church bells rang as usual. Mr. Compton opened his fish stall with a cheery nod, though he sold less than half his haddock. And the milkman, despite everything, whistled as he did his rounds. But beneath the calm, something had shifted. The villagers walked more slowly past the Adams cottage now, their glances longer, more thoughtful. The curtains remained drawn. And though Leslie Adams was said to be resting at the vicarage, the house itself gave off a faint air of having been left behind, as if its heartbeat had been removed. Miss Marple, on her morning walk, paused near the low wall that edged the Adams' front garden. The dahlias were still blooming there, orange and yellow, too bold for the house's gray stone, but no one had deadheaded them since the fete. A fine layer of dust had gathered on the windowsill. She noted the state of the lock on the gate, latched from the inside. Someone had secured the property, though not with much conviction. The brass was dulled and the wood damp near the hinges. There was no sign of the constable who had been assigned to keep watch. Miss Marple walked on. She wasn't there trespass merely to observe. She found that people often overlooked the little things that revealed the most. How long post went uncollected, which flowers were watered, whether a front step bore scuff marks or not. Lives left traces, even in their absences. At the end of the lane she turned into Bellona Green, where she was expected for morning tea with Mrs. Lavinia Harcourt. The Harcourt sitting-room was a place of deliberate comfort prose patterned. Upholstery, lace antimacassars, and framed sketches of Rhodesian landscapes painted, rather poorly, by a cousin in the diplomatic service. But Lavinia herself was less soothing. She poured tea with the severity of a schoolmistress and stirred hers 3 times, precisely. "I cannot imagine how this has happened here, Miss Marple," she said for the 3rd time. "Murder at a village fete. A fete one organized myself." "Life," said Miss Marple gently, "often takes its most dreadful turns in the loveliest of settings. The Romans understood that memento mori in the middle of gardens." Lavinia blinked, slightly startled. "Yes, well." She recovered herself with a sniff and added, "And now the inspector keeps asking us about boundaries and garden paths, as though fencing disputes lead to bloodshed." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Sometimes they do, especially when people attach meaning to land. Ownership is such a fragile idea, don't you think? One line of ink on a document, and suddenly a patch of grass becomes a battlefield." Lavinia colored faintly but did not disagree. "And tell me," Miss Marple said, setting her cup down lightly, "do you remember seeing anyone unfamiliar near the summer house before it all happened? Someone from outside the fete?" Lavinia paused. "No, no strangers. Though now you ask, I did see Emily Carstone speaking to someone behind the tea tent. I assumed it was young Michael Lang, but I only saw the back of his head. Brown jacket, dark hair, seemed tense, that's all. That's helpful, Miss Marple said with a nod. And I wonder, did you happen to hear Mr. Adams quarreling? With anyone recently? Lavinia's lips thinned. Only with his wife. Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. Oh? Oh, yes. I overheard it quite plainly 3 days before the fete. I was pruning the wisteria by the north wall, awful job. Thorns everywhere, and they were just on the other side, near their back steps. It wasn't loud, but sharp, like glass underfoot. Do you recall what was said? Lavinia hesitated. Something about a letter. He accused her of hiding one. She denied it. He said, "You think I don't know who it's from?" Something like that. Then she said, "You have no right to speak to me like that, not after what you've done." And then the door slammed. Miss Marple pressed her lips together for a thoughtful moment. "Letters," she murmured. "So many truths start on paper, don't they?" Later that day, as the light filtered through the high windows of the Market Dean Library, Miss Marple found herself thumbing through a copy of the Gardener's Gazette. Miss Marple had not come to the library in search of horticultural guidance, though she had always admired a well-trained clematis. Rather, she sought a distraction. Even she recognized that at times one must cease deliberate thought in order for deeper patterns to reveal themselves. She had scarcely reached the second page of her book when the librarian, Miss Pennyfeather, leaned across the counter with a conspiratorial air. "I oughtn't to gossip," she began, a phrase which invariably heralded exactly that, but Mr. Beckwith was in earlier. He was looking for land registry documents, old maps, something to do with easements and footpaths. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Indeed? I do hope he finds what he seeks." "So do I," Miss Pennyfeather replied in a lowered voice. "Though I never took him for the inquisitive sort. Still, he seemed rather intense." "Perhaps grief," Miss Marple suggested gently. Miss Pennyfeather raised an eyebrow. "Or guilt." That evening or gathering, not officially convened, of course was held in the village hall. It was described merely as a meeting of concerned residents to discuss how best to proceed. Mr. Pettigrew presided with pompous gravity, referring often to notes written in green ink. The vicar offered a brief prayer, after which suggestions were bandied about with the flurry of startled pigeons. "Install a lock on the summer house." "Raise funds for lighting along the garden paths." "Call for an investigator from London." Miss Marple sat silently in the rear row, knitting a sock and saying nothing. It was Mrs. Carmichael who eventually turned the attention towards her. "You've been very quiet, Miss Marple," she remarked. "Surely you have thoughts?" Miss Marple looked up, her needles momentarily still. "I do, but thoughts, like fruit, are best when they've ripened. Premature opinions can distort sound judgment, and in matters of life and death, that is no small thing." A hush followed. Mr. Pettigrew cleared his throat. "Yes, quite right indeed." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind already far removed from wool and yarn. Later, beneath a golden harvest moon, she walked home alone, her thoughts winding around her like the cool mist on the lane. A quarrel, a letter, a man asking after maps, a garden gate left swinging, and a woman who looked at her own house as though she had never truly lived in it. Terence Adams had not been beloved, but he had mattered enough to be removed. And the person who had done so had been calm, deliberate, cold. At her doorstep, Miss Marple paused. The distant clock of the church tower struck 10. She looked to the stars and whispered. It wasn't rage, it was fear, but not the victims. Then she stepped inside and gently closed the door. By midweek, the whispers had solidified into convictions, as they often did in St. Bede's, and once such opinions hardened, they moved with the weight and certainty of well-baked scones. Leslie Adams, it was agreed, was not behaving as a widow should. She had not wept in public. She had not taken to bed. She had accepted condolences with a cool, polite reserve. No tears, no fainting, no drama. Most damning of all, she had been seen walking beside her former fiancé, Gerald Beckwith, along Church Lane. By Thursday. The conclusion was shared openly over tea, and in the grocer's queue, Leslie must have known something. Perhaps even done something. She didn't scream, said Mrs. Chalmers with grim finality. She went silent. That's not grief. That's calculation. She asked about his pocket watch, added Miss Blount, as though his belongings mattered more than his life. In her sitting room, folding a lace shawl and listening faintly through the open window, Miss Marple allowed herself a slight smile. People always noticed the volume of a woman's grief, but never its shape, Inspector Crisp, on the other hand, had no patience for gossip. He arrived at the vicarage with a weary gait and a bundle of paperwork beneath his arm. Fatigue had sharpened his temper. "I'm not accusing the widow," he said to Reverend Fletcher, who had offered him a lukewarm cup of tea. "But there was no forced entry, nothing missing, no known enemies. And the argument they had, it's relevant." The Reverend looked genuinely distressed. "But she's here, under our roof. Surely you cannot believe that Leslie, dear girl, struck her husband down with a garden trowel?" Inspector Crisp sighed, but did not respond directly. Instead, he opened his notebook. 3 residents now say they overheard arguments before. The fate. Mrs. Harcourt mentioned a letter. Miss Blount heard something about keeping secrets, and then, of course, there is Mr. Beckwith. "A solicitor calling on a married woman after dark," the Reverend murmured. "That might be chivalry or motive." Crisp turned to look out the window. Leslie sat alone in the garden, a parasol shading her from the sun. A book rested open in her lap, unread. "I've seen guilt before," the inspector said quietly. "But she looks more like someone holding her breath." Meanwhile, Miss Marple had gone walking without declaring a destination and without the slightest intention of returning empty-minded. Her path led her to the narrow lane behind the Harcourt's property, where a little used footpath traced the rear boundary. There she paused by a broken gate, nearly swallowed by hedgerows. It led into the Harcourt's garden, not 30 feet from the summer house. The earth showed faint disturbances, subtle but distinct. Someone had stood there recently. She knelt and picked up a small, weather-worn scrap of paper. It had survived the morning dew and midday sun. In bold black ink it read, "Absolutely unacceptable to proceed without my name on the document." She folded it carefully and tucked it into her handbag. Just then the gravel behind her shifted. "Miss Marple?" It was Gerald Beckwith, emerging from the hedge path with a rolled bundle of documents. He looked surprised. "Oh, Mr. Beckwith," she said pleasantly, as if they had met outside the greengrocer. "I was examining the Harcourt's property line. There appears to be something peculiar about the fencing." He glanced toward the summer house, then back at her. "Leslie had nothing to do with it, Miss Marple," he said firmly. "She and Terence had their differences. But she is not violent." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Love leads people to odd ends, Mr. Beckwith, but fear ... drives them further." He looked startled, defensive. "You mean to say she was afraid of him?" "I suggest nothing, but someone certainly was." "You ask about their differences," he said at last. "Terence was controlling, possessive. Leslie wanted to leave him, but feared scandal. And she feared him. She told me that herself. 2 weeks ago. Did she ever write anything down?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. "Letters, private ones. I've kept them." "Wise," she replied softly. "Words often outlast the ones who write them." That evening the vicar's wife found Leslie alone in the churchyard. "You'll catch a chill." "My dear," she said gently. Leslie turned slowly. Her face was unreadable. "I used to find graves frightening," she murmured. "Now they seem ... peaceful. Shall I walk you back?" "No, but thank you." The vicar's wife hesitated, then added, "Inspector Crisp may return tomorrow. He may have more questions." Leslie gave a faint nod. "They all want to ask if I did it? Even when they don't say so?" "My dear girl, they don't." "Believe someone like me could be unhappy," Leslie said. "Because I wear nice clothes? Because I smile?" The vicar's wife said nothing. Leslie turned her gaze to a nearby headstone. "But I was, and I am." The following morning brought a new ripple to the village waters. Michael Lang, a carpenter's apprentice with muddy boots and a quiet manner, was seen speaking privately with Inspector Crisp near the constables. "Hut, never trust a quiet one," muttered Miss Blount. "Still waters run deep." "He was helping with the fate," added Mrs. Nettle. "Near the garden path. Slipped off on his own. Could have used the back gate." Crisp confirmed that Michael had seen a woman on the back path. Blonde but older, not Leslie, perhaps Mrs. Harcourt. He speculated. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "A woman who didn't want to be seen? Possibly. You believe him? He seemed earnest." But memory's a fragile thing. Miss Marple placed her cup down with care. "Then you have three possibilities, Inspector. A widow without visible grief, a solicitor with reasons to protect, and now, perhaps, a lady with secrets buried in her own garden." Crisp sighed. "Not much to go on." "Then find the smallest thing," she said softly. "Murder is never solved by the obvious. It's always the one thing someone forgot to hide." As the sun dipped behind the yew trees, Miss Marple once again stood near the garden gate behind the Harcourt's property. This time it was closed, but not latched. The sky was the dull, uncommitted gray of a Sunday crossword, and a faint wind stirred the hedgerows behind Miss Marple's cottage. She had spent the morning sorting through old sewing tins and checking the index of a worn book on the evolution of English garden design, ostensibly looking for a reference to Victorian summer houses, though in truth her mind was far from any architectural pursuit. The problem was that everything seemed to be in order, and yet something fundamental was out of place. Three suspects, as she had told Inspector Crisp, Leslie Adams, Gerald Beckwith, Lavinia Harcourt. Each had motive, and each stood to gain, if not materially, then emotionally, from Terence Adams's death. But something about the method disturbed her. The use of the garden trowel, not a weapon of passion, but one of proximity. It required closeness, steadiness, a willingness to approach the victim face to face, or, at the very least, from within arm's reach. Which raised a troubling question. Who in St. Bede's was calm enough to strike with such intent and quiet enough to vanish without anyone seeing? By midday the weather had cleared, and Miss Marple, bonnet in place, walked the narrow path behind the Harcourt's garden once more. She moved slowly, as she always did, but her eyes were sharp. Reaching the place where she had found the torn paper days earlier, she stepped off the path and into the damp undergrowth. It was slightly overgrown, the soil soft from the recent rain. A pair of blackbirds startled from the branches above, scattering raindrops in their wake. Miss Marple crouched, her gloved hands brushing aside nettles, until something caught her attention. Just to the left of the path, beneath a clutch of elderflower stems, half buried in the soil, was a small object, a broken pencil, snapped at the midpoint. One end was blunt, and the shaft bore a faint smear of rust-colored earth. She picked it up carefully. There was something familiar about it, not just in shape, but in placement, deliberate, forgotten, or more likely discarded. Later that afternoon she visited Inspector Crisp, who was seated at his desk, surrounded by what he called his stack of inconclusives, notes, statements, and items recovered from the scene that hadn't amounted to much. She laid the pencil before him. "I thought you might like to add this to your collection," she said. He peered at it skeptically. "Another gardening tool?" "No, but perhaps an instrument of planning." Crisp picked it up, turning it between thumb and forefinger. "Snapped in half, like someone snapped it in anger." "Or to conceal it," Miss Marple said. "You'll find that Mr. Beckwith uses this very type of green and white casing, soft lead, slightly flattened on one side. It's his habit to press down hard when writing." Crisp looked up. "You think this belonged to Beckwith, perhaps? Or to someone who used his desk recently?" He considered this. "The Adams house? We haven't searched the desk there yet, waiting on full permission from the coroner." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Then I should think it wise to keep this pencil safe until you do. Letters have been mentioned. So have quarrels. And what are quarrels but spoken letters without the benefit of editing?" Crisp frowned and pocketed the pencil. "And what if it's nothing? Then we'll have ruled out something." which is its own kind of discovery. That evening, a minor revelation came from an unexpected source. Young Emily Carstone, still somewhat shaken by her discovery at the fete, was spotted at the village hall's choir rehearsal and afterwards spoke quietly to Miss Marple by the vestry steps. "I didn't remember until now," she said, her voice low and urgent. "It came to me this morning. Just before I screamed that day, I heard something." "A voice?" Emily nodded. "A whisper. Behind me, just a few words, but it didn't make sense at the time. I was walking toward the trellis and I heard, 'It's already done.' That's what was said." "Just that." Miss Marple blinked. "You're sure?" "Yes, a woman's voice, I think. But I was so focused on the body that I didn't register it until afterward." "Did you recognize the voice?" Emily hesitated. "It wasn't Mrs. Adams or Mrs. Harcourt, I don't think so. But it was very near, just beyond the hedge." Miss Marple thanked her with quiet kindness. Sometimes memory needs quiet. "To speak," she said, and her mind turned immediately to a possibility she hadn't fully considered. The following morning, Inspector Crisp received official clearance to examine the Adams house. Miss Marple, of course, did not accompany him, though. She took a longer route to the grocer's that day, one that happened to pass by Bologna Lane just as the inspector emerged from the cottage, looking windblown and frustrated. "Well?" she asked, pausing politely beside a hedge of overgrown hawthorn. "Found a drawer of letters. Most from Leslie's mother, one oddly unsigned. A short note, folded in a sheet of writing paper. Very clean, very recent. It reads, 'You don't need to be afraid anymore. He'll be gone soon.'" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And where was it?" "Inside a gardening almanac on the desk. Not addressed?" "No, no envelope either." She gave a slight nod. "Whoever wrote it wanted reassurance to be found eventually," he exhaled. "Which brings us back to Beckwith. Or to someone who wanted it to look like Beckwith." Crisp grimaced. "Everyone's a suspect again." Miss Marple said nothing. She was watching a robin hop across the Adams front step. That evening, the knitting group met in the back room of the post office. Conversation turned inevitably toward the murder. "I think it was jealousy," said Miss Blount. "Gerald still loved Leslie. He never moved on. If he thought Terence was mistreating her well, men have done worse for less. I still say Leslie herself had cause," Mrs. Carmichael insisted. "What wife wouldn't snap under pressure?" Miss Marple, knitting steadily, looked up and said mildly, "Do you know, I once read of a case where the victim's own secretary arranged his demise not for love but for legacy. You'd be amazed what secrets people bury in the margins. Of letters and daybooks." The others fell silent. It was, perhaps, the first moment when the idea of a fourth suspect truly entered the room. Later, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple laid out the fragments in her mind like patchwork. A snapped pencil, possibly Beckwith's. A torn note about documentation. A whispered phrase, "It's already done." A letter of comfort unsigned. Undated, and a garden gate that would not close when it always had before. Too many threads, and yet... She rose, crossed to her bookshelf, and took down a journal one of her own, from 3 summers ago. She flipped through the pages until she found what she wanted, an entry noting a Harcourt garden party. "Gate fixed boasts Mrs. Harcourt. Very proud," closes with click. And yet that day it had not. She returned to her chair, sat down, and whispered, "Someone needed it open, not to flee, but to enter unseen." The mystery, she now realized, did not begin with the murder. It began with the invitation. The clouds hung low over St. Bede's, casting the village in a pewter gloom. It wasn't yet raining, but the air was heavy with the promise of it, like a withheld sigh. At the corner of Mill Lane, church bells tolled a half-hour late and unusual, occurrence that set off a fresh round of speculation in the tea shop where the town's pulse beat strongest. Miss Marple had not taken her usual table that morning. Instead, she was already seated in Lavinia Harcourt's modest drawing-room, a cup of weak chamomile cooling in her hand and her lace gloves resting neatly on her lap. "I've always thought," Miss Marple said conversationally, "that gardens are more revealing than parlors. One must be terribly careful what one lets grow wild. Lavinia gave a tense little smile. She looked tired, but not disheveled. Her hands, clasped around a napkin, were white at the knuckles. "Are you suggesting something, Miss Marple?" she asked coolly, only that every garden has its secrets. I often find it useful to ask myself what isn't blooming. There was a silence, during which the faint ticking of a wall clock filled the room. Then Lavinia said, "If you came to ask whether I had anything to do with Terence's death, you can say it outright." Miss Marple blinked gently. "Oh, dear." "Me, no, that's the sort of question one only asks when one's quite certain of the answer. I've merely come to return a tray you lent me last month." She set the silver tray down on a sideboard. Lavinia blinked. It was an ordinary tray, certainly, but she hadn't even noticed it missing. She opened her mouth to say something. But Miss Marple continued, "Still, while I am here, you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. That garden gate at the Whodunit never did close properly, did it?" Lavinia looked startled. "I suppose not." "And yet, just a few. Summers ago you told me quite proudly that it had been repaired. 'Closes with a click,' I recall your exact phrase." There was a pause. "Yes," Lavinia said, quieter now. "It was fixed. And yet that day it stood open." "I didn't notice," she said quickly, too quickly. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then perhaps someone else did." Inspector Crisp was having no such luck with Leslie Adams. She sat opposite him at the police station, arms crossed, red scarf wound too tightly about her throat as if against some invisible chill. She had agreed to come in voluntarily, but with the defiant grace of a woman who felt unfairly summoned. "Terence could be cruel," she said at last. "And when he wasn't cruel, he was worse, distant, cold. He made a point of humiliating people in ways that couldn't be called abuse because no one ever heard the words. "Were you afraid of him?" Crisp asked. Leslie's chin lifted. "No, but I pitied anyone who wasn't." "And yet you stayed married. We're not all afforded the luxury of escape, Inspector." "I had a child. I had obligations." Crisp made a note. "Did you write this letter?" he asked, handing her a typed copy of the message found in the gardening almanac. "You don't need to be afraid any more. He'll be gone soon." She barely glanced at it. "No? Do you recognize the phrasing?" "No. Could someone have written it for you? On your behalf?" She looked at him now, sharply. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying. I'm asking." But she didn't answer. Crisp folded the note and slipped it away. "I understand Gerald Beckwith visited your house recently," he continued. She laughed bitterly. "Oh yes, the hero returns. He came with gardening books and questions about boundaries, as if he hadn't crossed plenty already." Crisp leaned forward. "And you didn't speak of your husband's treatment, ask for help?" "I don't need rescuing." "Then, why the bruises?" he asked quietly. She froze. "You've done a poor job of concealing them, Mrs. Adams. A scarf won't erase history." A long pause followed. Then, in a voice that barely carried, "I never asked anyone to kill him. But if someone did, I wouldn't weep." Meanwhile, Miss Marple had decided on a visit of a different sort, one that took her to Gerald Beckwith's book-lined cottage at the edge of the village. He answered the door in his waistcoat, sleeves rolled up, spectacles hanging from one ear. He looked more worn than usual, and his eyes darkened when he saw her. "I suppose you've come to accuse me as well?" he said, stepping aside to let her in. "Oh, goodness, no," she said with an air of mild surprise. "I haven't the authority for that." "You do seem to have the influence," he muttered. "I find, Mr. Beckwith, that influence is rarely useful when people have already made up their minds." She settled into the armchair he gestured. "Two." He ran a hand through his graying hair and sat opposite her. "I was in love with her once," he said without prompting. "Years ago, long before she married that man. She mentioned you visited her recently. I brought a few gardening books and a pamphlet about native herbs. Thought it might be something for her to explore, something that belonged just to her, you see." Miss Marple nodded gently. "That was kind of you." "I never expected anything," he said. "Just wanted her to have something alive in her life again?" She hesitated, then leaned forward. "Did you leave her any notes?" He blinked. "Notes? Encouragement, perhaps. A letter slipped between pages. No, he said slowly. Though, he paused. I did notice someone had left a piece of paper in one of the books already on her desk. An almanac. Did you read it? I only glimpsed it. It wasn't signed. Looked like a woman's hand. Miss Marple was silent a moment. Then she said, "You keep your pencils sharpened to a particular point. Flattened side, soft graphite. It's rather distinctive." He gave a sad little smile. I learned to write in charcoal years ago on butcher's paper. Old habits stick. Would you happen to have lent one to Leslie? No, though I might have left one there. She looked at him closely, then nodded. It must be difficult, she said softly, to watch someone you care for suffer in silence and know you can do so little. His face twisted slightly. I would never have harmed him. Not for her, not for anyone. I believe you, Miss Marple said gently. But in her heart, she wasn't so certain she could believe everyone else. By the week's end, the village had begun to settle into its ritual of cautious speculation. The murder had not repeated. No more bodies had turned up. But whispers had multiplied, and beneath the polite hellos and church pew nods, there lingered a sense of unfinished business, as though the air itself waited for a confession. That Saturday, Miss Marple returned to the fete grounds. The bunting had been taken down, the tables cleared. Only the trellis arch remained half-toppled, petals strewn like confetti. She stood beside the now-fixed garden gate. It clicked shut behind her, so someone had kept it open. And not by accident. Someone had planned for a quiet entry, not to escape but to arrive unseen. The killer had not fled. They had waited. Waited for the right moment. Waited, perhaps, for the sound of a whispered phrase behind a hedge. It's already done. Chapter 4. It was the following Tuesday when the second shock came to St. Bede's delivered, not with the drama of a corpse beneath bunting, but through a quietly unsettling discovery that rippled across the village like a stone dropped into a still pond. The postmistress, young Sally Goff, had been sorting the morning mail when she noticed a battered brown envelope addressed to Mr. Gerald Beckwith, private and urgent. She might have thought nothing of it had it not arrived without a stamp, without a postmark, and curiously, without being dropped in the official box. Sally had found it nestled between the panes of the post office's rear window, slipped in as though from someone who knew the building well. She told the constable, of course, and the constable told Inspector Crisp, who in turn had it opened in his presence. Inside was a single sheet of writing paper, typed, again, no salutation. No name, just a few chilling lines. You're looking in the wrong places. Look under what's been left untouched. He didn't fall, asterisk, he was placed. Not everyone plays the part you think. Inspector Crisp stared at the note. The edges were slightly singed as though someone had nearly burned it and changed their mind. No fingerprints, no handwriting, no identifiable marks. I don't suppose this simplifies matters, he muttered grimly, passing it to Sergeant Burroughs. No, sir. If anything, it feels like a warning. Crisp stood, jaw tight. It is a warning, and perhaps a confession. And either way, someone in this village is enjoying themselves far too much. Gerald Beckwith, for his part, was more irritated than afraid. It's a riddle, he snapped, pacing his cottage. A game. Some twisted creature thinks this is a parlor mystery. He turned to Miss Marple, who had arrived with her knitting bag, but no knitting. She sat by the window, looking out at the wind-stirred hedges as though they might murmur a solution if she waited long enough. I don't think it's meant to amuse, she said gently. I think it's meant to guide. A very particular kind of misdirection, drawing attention away from what we believe we know. He stopped pacing. You think they're mocking us? Not mocking, she said, folding her hands. Testing. She let the word linger in the room like the scent of pipe smoke. Look under what's been left untouched, she repeated. It's the sort of thing a gardener might say, isn't it? A reminder to dig where the ground looks undisturbed, where roots hide quietly. He frowned. You think it has something to do with the grounds? I think, she said, standing slowly, that the fete was a stage and someone arranged the props very carefully. Later that day, Inspector Crisp stood once again at the scene of the fete, though now it bore little resemblance to the joyous assembly of 10 days ago. The hedgerows had been trimmed back, the tables carted away, but the turf beneath the rose trellis was still marred by a square of faded earth, a patch of slightly lighter grass, precisely where Terence Adams had been found. Crisp knelt beside it. The soil was dry, odd that. The gardeners said it had been damp the day of the fete due to early morning watering. He stood up abruptly. "Burrows," he called. "Fetch the groundskeeper and tell him to bring the fete setup map. I want to know what wasn't moved." 20 minutes later, he was looking at a detailed drawing of the fete layout. Booths, tables, chairs all accounted for, except one thing. "There was a donation box here," the groundskeeper said, pointing to a small shaded patch on the map. "Under the willow tree? But it never got collected. Why not?" He hesitated. "I was told it had gone missing." "Who told you that?" I can't remember." "Might have been Miss Lavinia." Crisp's mouth tightened. "Show me the exact spot." They walked past the flower beds and herb stalls to a mossy clearing beneath the willows' drooping branches. There, half sunken in the earth and entirely obscured by grass, was the faint outline of a square wooden base. Crisp knelt. The soil was compacted but not natural. Someone had carefully replaced it. Burrows handed him a spade. 15 minutes later they unearthed the missing donation box empty, save for a single item tucked beneath the false bottom. A small folded handkerchief, stained red. Miss Marple was seated quietly at the vicarage when she heard the news from Reverend Wilcox, who had, as always, learned it second-hand from Mrs. Graves the organist, who had heard it from her nephew, who delivered milk to the station. She received it with her usual calm. "A handkerchief?" she asked softly. "With blood?" the Reverend confirmed, nervously stirring his tea. "And it was placed beneath the donation box? So I understand?" "How curious," she murmured. "A donation of sorts, wouldn't you say?" "A tithe of guilt." The Reverend blinked. "You think it's a clue?" "I think," she said, "that it's a message, left only for someone clever enough to find it and cautious enough to conceal it." She didn't explain further. Instead, she asked if she might visit the vicarage's records room. The Reverend, though puzzled, agreed. Within the hour, Miss Marple was deep in ledgers and festival minutes, flipping through attendance rosters, set-up plans, and charity tallies. She paused on one page. Her finger tapped a line. "Donations for the Widows' Fund are to be collected and kept by Lavinia Harcourt. Final figures to be reported after the fete." She leaned back in her creaking chair. It wasn't merely a question of who had the box last, but of who had an excuse to go near it once everything had ended. Meanwhile, Inspector Crisp was paying a visit to the Harcourt residence. Lavinia opened the door in her usual attire, a pressed, if slightly faded, silk blouse. Her eyes, however, betrayed not sorrow, but a flicker of irritation. "Another round of questions?" she asked dryly. "I'm afraid so." She led him to the sitting room. Signs of departure were everywhere, half-filled boxes, neatly folded papers. "Planning a trip?" he asked. "To my sister's inn, Wiltshire. Just a brief reprieve from all this." "Surely that's not suspicious." Crisp said nothing. Instead, he withdrew a sealed evidence bag and placed its contents, a handkerchief, on the table. "Do you recognize this?" Lavinia paled. The pattern was faint but unmistakable. "I know." "Why would I?" "It was found inside the missing donation box. I didn't know it had been recovered. No one did, not until today." Her fingers tightened around the armrest. "I don't know what that is." "You helped collect donations. You were seen near the willow tree after the fete ended." "I was tidying." "You were also seen burning paper in your garden incinerator that evening." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "Old receipts." Crisp straightened. "I hope, for your sake, none of them were from typewriter ink." A silence settled between them. Then Lavinia said coolly, "You're chasing shadows. A handkerchief proves nothing." He pocketed the evidence and left, but doubt remained. And in the quiet folds of the village the stories began to twist. And curl anew, that night Miss Marple sat by her window. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap. She had seen Lavinia Harcourt earlier that afternoon, standing motionless beneath the post office sign. She wasn't posting a letter, she was simply watching. As if waiting for something or someone. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The handkerchief had been planted deliberately. Its timing was too convenient. And that phrase from the anonymous note, asterisk, "Not everyone plays the part you think, asterisk," still clung to her thoughts like dew on cobweb silk. She thought again of the fate, the staged laughter, the well-practiced kindness. Gerald Beckwith's quiet melancholy, Leslie's icy composure, Lavinia's tightly wound grief. And the garden gate always open until someone made certain it wasn't. She looked out into the darkness. Another layer had peeled back, but the heart of the story remained hidden. For now. The following Friday morning, after a long and reflective breakfast over the Times and a slightly overboiled egg, Miss Marple made what might be called a decisive move. Not a move that would appear decisive not to the casual observer, but one carefully designed to test a theory she had been weaving quietly, thread by thread. She invited Lavinia Harcourt to tea. This, in itself, was unremarkable. Miss Marple was known for her tea invitations, particularly to those in grief. And Lavinia, whose movements had grown increasingly guarded of late, accepted with a smile that seemed just a touch too composed. "I do think a proper Darjeeling helps one think more clearly," Miss Marple said, laying out the tea service with practiced grace. "There's something very reassuring about tea rituals, don't you find?" Lavinia folded her hands in her lap. "Yes, it puts things in order," Miss Marple poured. "I often compare it to knitting. The pattern may not be visible at first, but when the rows begin to form, one can always spot a dropped stitch. Even if someone tries to hide it?" Lavinia's fingers tightened on her cup. "Oh, but I'm rambling," Miss Marple said breezily, adding sugar to her tea. "I've been thinking rather a lot about poor Terence Adams, such a tragedy. And at the fate of all places." "I can't imagine who would do such a thing," Lavinia murmured. And then there's that handkerchief so conveniently discovered beneath the donation box. Quite theatrical, don't you think?" Lavinia's cup paused mid-air. "Almost as though someone wanted it to be found," Miss Marple continued. "But then theatrics often mask something else entirely. A distraction, really, like a magician's sleight of hand." Lavinia placed her cup down with care. "Are you suggesting it was planted?" Miss Marple gave a small shrug. "Well, if one wished to cover their tracks, or frame someone." She let the sentence trail away like steam from the teapot. A silence followed. Then Lavinia said, "Do you think Inspector Crisp believes I'm involved?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, I wouldn't imagine anything of the kind. He's a very thorough man. Still, anonymous notes do tend to complicate things." Lavinia blinked. "You know about the notes?" "I do," Miss Marple replied. "And I think I understand why they were written. Quite curated, wouldn't you say? The writer knew precisely which buttons to press, which strings to pull." Lavinia's hands fell into her lap. Miss Marple leaned forward, voice soft as spun wool. "Do you believe in justice, Lavinia?" "What a strange question. Not at all. Justice, I've always felt, is much like gardening. One must be quite sure what one is digging up and why. Some roots run deep, and sometimes what grows looks harmless, until you see what's underneath." Lavinia didn't answer, but her face rigid, pale, flickering at the corners, was answer enough. Elsewhere, Inspector Crisp was conducting a test of a different sort. He had summoned Gerald Beckwith to the station, not formally, but firmly. Beckwith arrived in a brown wool coat that was far too warm for the day. His face, usually composed, carried the air of a man bracing for impact. "You wanted to see me?" he said, standing stiffly. "Yes, Mr. Beckwith," Crisp replied, motioning for him to sit. "I've been reviewing some fate footage." "There's footage?" Mrs. Ames had her new video camera. "Caught bits and pieces. What's interesting is that it shows you speaking to Terence Adams near the west hedge about 15 minutes before he was found." Gerald's gightened. We did speak, yes. You argued. Yes. Crisp waited. Beckwith exhaled and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Terence had information about me. Things I wanted kept private. What kind of information? From my time in London? Before I moved to St. Bede's, my brother committed fraud, embezzlement. I covered for him. Paid back what I could. It nearly ruined me. But I managed to avoid scandal. You believe Terence was blackmailing you? I know he was. He hinted at correspondence letters. But I never saw anything, just threats and insinuations. Crisp nodded slowly. So you had motive? I did, but I didn't kill him. We'll see, said Crisp, that afternoon. As summer clouds gathered above, Miss Marple walked down the lane to Leslie Adams' cottage. Leslie herself answered, looking weary. Her eyes were swollen, but her composure intact. Miss Marple, she said, surprised. Please come in. The sitting room was tidy and spare. A closed, dustless piano stood against the far wall. Miss Marple took her usual chair near the window. It's such a comfort, she said softly, to return to familiar places when everything inside one's heart feels unfamiliar. Leslie nodded but said nothing. I wanted to ask you something, Miss Marple continued. A small thing. At the fete you arrived early? Yes, I helped set up the tea tent. And afterward, when the fete ended? I stayed to tidy, went home around 6. Did you notice the donation box beneath the willow? Leslie blinked. No, should I have? Only because it vanished. Oddly, it wasn't taken far. It was buried. As though someone wanted it hidden but not gone. Leslie said nothing, but her eyes narrowed. I found something unusual in the church records, Miss Marple added. A note from your late husband. He lent someone money. Not officially, but generously. Leslie's breath caught. Terence borrowed it, didn't he? More than once. I didn't know the details. Money can tangle things, Miss Marple murmured. Even love, especially love. Leslie rose abruptly. Miss Marple, what exactly are you implying? Nothing at all, my dear, miss. Marple replied gently. Only that guilt is a heavy garment, and sometimes we wear it even in summer. That evening Miss Marple returned to her quiet cottage. Outside, the wind stirred. The old garden gate creaked, no longer swinging freely. Someone had finally fixed the latch, and yet she wasn't sure it should be closed. She lit her lamp and began to write, not notes for the police, but a letter. To the person she now believed had written the anonymous notes. It was time for one final test, a subtle one, the kind only Miss Marple could give. Chapter 5 asterisk. The letter Miss Marple wrote was brief, composed in a fine, looping script and sealed with wax old-fashioned but deliberate. She left it just after dawn, placing it inside the slotted gate of the old tool shed beside the church, where only one person would find it. She didn't need a reply. She only needed a reaction. And as it happened, she got one. By 9 o'clock, Lavinia Harcourt was seen pacing outside the church hall, her face pale and drawn. The vicar noticed her from the window and offered a wave, but she turned away abruptly and disappeared down the gravel path toward the green. It was a small act, but in a village like St. Bede's, small acts echoed loudly. Miss Marple watched all this unfold from her usual seat in the churchyard, where she claimed she had come to enjoy the blooms of the old rose bushes. Her hands rested gently in her lap, but her eyes missed nothing. At 10:15, she quietly made her way to the police station. Inspector Crisp was at his desk, papers spread before him like battle plans. He glanced up when Miss Marple entered, and though he had grown to respect her quiet tenacity, there was still a furrow of doubt along his brow. I take it you've come with another theory, he said. I do hope you won't think me interfering, Miss Marple replied pleasantly, but I believe the time has come to look not just at what happened, but why it happened the way it did. Crisp folded his arms. I'm listening. She sat across from him. We must consider the sequence. Mr. Adams died during the fete, sometime between 5 and 6 o'clock. The donation box was emptied and buried likely by the same person. And curiously, an anonymous note had been slipped into the vicarage before the body was discovered. We've confirmed that, Crisp said. It was delivered between 4:30 and 5, Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. Now we must ask, what was the purpose of that note? To warn? To distract or to mislead? Crisp said nothing. The anonymous note accused Terence of dishonesty, Miss Marple continued. Fraud, theft, and worse. But it was anonymous. And though terribly convenient, it arrived just in time to cast doubt on the victim's character. You're saying someone wanted him discredited? Crisp asked slowly. I am. Because that's precisely what the killer needed, a motive the village would accept, while diverting suspicion away from themselves. And who, in your opinion, would have wanted that? Miss Marple tilted her head. Someone who knew the donation box would go missing. Someone who could bury it nearby, quickly, because they knew exactly where it was placed. Someone who wanted the police to focus on Terence's supposed crimes, rather than on any motive for murder. She reached into her reticule and handed him a copy of the note she had written the night before. Inspector Crisp read it, eyes narrowing. I know what you did. You tried to fix the gate, but it still swings open, it always does. She came to the church this morning, Miss Marple said. I left the note where she'd find it. She took it. But she didn't destroy it or bring it to you. Instead, she panicked. Lavinia Harcourt, Crisp said. Miss Marple nodded. She didn't kill Terence directly, I believe. But she did help cover it up. I think she buried the box. I think she may have written the notes. And I think she knows exactly who did the killing. Crisp tapped a pencil on his desk. Gerald. Beckwith? No, Miss Marple said calmly. He had motive, yes, but he is far too vain to risk his new, carefully rebuilt life for vengeance. Leslie Adams? She had grief, resentment, but not hatred, and no practical knowledge of where the box was kept. And besides, she would never have involved Lavinia. Inspector Crisp frowned. Then who? Miss Marple's voice dropped. The person who fixed the latch on the garden gate. He blinked. I'm not sure I follow. Miss Marple leaned forward. The latch hadn't worked for years. Everyone knew it. It was practically a village joke. But it was fixed the day after the murder? Quietly, no announcement? As if someone had suddenly grown self-conscious of that. Small, persistent creak. Crisp narrowed his eyes. Who? He asked again. By midday, the village had begun to stir with rumors. Lavinia Harcourt had not returned home. The vicar had received another note, this one unsigned, but very different in tone, less accusatory, more apologetic. And by 1:30, Inspector Crisp and Constable Webb arrived at the Harcourt home with a warrant in hand. What they found in the sitting-room drawer confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. 6 handwritten notes, each on the same parchment, folded twice, each bearing damning accusations against Terence Adams, and on one of them a faint outline of a fingerprint in ink, consistent with a right thumb. A woman's. Lavinia had left the village by foot, but not before someone had seen her at the station in Market Cleave, boarding a northbound train. It was at 3:30 when Miss Marple received a visitor. He arrived with slumped shoulders and trembling hands. Douglas Fielding. I didn't mean to, he said softly, after she had poured tea and offered shortbread. I didn't mean to kill him. Miss Marple gave a small nod, as though she had expected this all along. Douglas stared into his teacup. He was going to ruin Lavinia. She'd helped him once, years ago, money, I think, during a difficult patch. But then he began threatening her. Letters, veiled demands, always dressed up as invitations for support. He'd done it before to others, but Lavinia was fragile. He took a breath. I saw them arguing by the donation box. She was shaking. Terence had a look mocking. He always enjoyed power. He walked off. I followed him. I didn't know what I meant to do, just frighten him. Miss Marple folded her hands. You confronted him, she said. Yes, behind the willow. He made a joke, called me her lapdog. I shoved him. He stumbled, hit his head on the iron spade left beside the flower beds. Miss Marple's voice was soft. And then? I checked his pulse. Nothing. I panicked. I hid the body behind the hedge and ran. I told Lavinia everything that night. She was terrified, but she said we couldn't come forward. She said no one would believe it was an accident. And so she buried the box, planted the notes. She said it was to protect me. But I think she was afraid of losing everything. Her standing, her house, her peace. Miss Marple offered him a quiet, almost maternal glance. There is always a price for silence, Mr. Fielding, and the truth has a way of finding its path. Even through a garden gate that never quite stays shut? The days that followed in St. Bede's were unusually subdued, as though the very trees lining the green had lowered their branches in mourning or quiet shame. The village fete, now a distant memory, seemed almost indecent in retrospect. Cheery spectacle covering the simmering discontent that had, quite literally, bled into the hedgerows. Douglas Fielding was taken quietly, with no scene or resistance. Miss Marple watched from her garden as the police car slipped past the crooked yew trees, trailing dust in the afternoon light. His face, visible through the smudged window glass, was composed, tired, the look of a man who had already faced his own judgment. It was Lavinia's absence that drew more attention. That Sunday morning her pew sat empty. No clink of her bracelets, no muffled whisper of her hymn-book pages turning just a fraction too loudly. She had not returned from her hasty trip to Market Cleave. Rumor had it she'd gone to stay with a cousin in Yorkshire, a woman who hadn't set foot in St. Bede's in 3 decades. Some said Lavinia had suffered a nervous collapse. Others claimed she had been summoned away by lawyers. No one truly knew. And that, Miss Marple reflected, was how things were in English villages. People stopped just shy of asking the final question content, or perhaps afraid to leave the last inch cloaked in shadow. But Miss Marple asked it, not always aloud. Sometimes only in the privacy of her sitting room, a cup of weak tea cooling beside her, embroidery in her lap. She would turn the final pieces over and over, examining not the event, but the motivations that had led to it. There was, as always, a lesson in the human heart. It was Monday when the vicar paid her a visit. He looked more worn than usual, his clerical collar slightly crooked, his trousers hastily pressed. "My dear Miss Marple," he said as she opened the door, "I hardly know what to say." "That's often the best place to begin, Reverend," she said gently. "Please, come in." She poured him a cup of tea Earl Grey with just a dash of milk, as she remembered he preferred, and waited while he sat himself with a grateful sigh. "She was one of our own," he said eventually, "Lavinia. She arranged flowers, led the summer fete committee, taught scripture at the school, and yet she carried fear in her chest like a stone," Miss Marple finished quietly. "People rarely do terrible things without terrible pressure." He nodded miserably. "And Douglas?" "Ah," Miss Marple said, stirring her tea. "A kind man and a weak one. Not weak in virtue, but in that English way, hoping to avoid unpleasantness at all costs, until unpleasantness grows teeth." The vicar smiled faintly despite himself. "We thought the gate was the trouble," he said after a pause. "That silly latch. Funny, isn't it? In the end, it was the one thing that helped reveal the truth." Miss Marple looked out the window to where the garden gate still stood ajar. "It was never the gate," she murmured. "Only what people wanted to keep closed." By Wednesday, the papers had arrived. Not the Times or the Telegraph, of course, those never concerned themselves with village crime unless royalty was involved. But the Mid-Cleve Gazette featured a front-page story, "Scandal at St. Bede's, local benefactor, found dead foul play suspected." The article was surprisingly restrained, thanks in no small part to Inspector Crisp, who had taken pains to protect certain details. No mention of Lavinia Harcourt, no mention of the donation box, and certainly no mention of the 7 unsigned notes, one of which still bore a faint trace of her perfume. The article instead emphasized the police's thoroughness, the sorrow of the community, and the importance of community trust and discretion in times of distress. But in village drawing rooms, those silences said more than any headline could. At the grocer's, Mrs. Pembroke whispered that Lavinia had been seen at the bank 3 days before Terence's death, arguing in hushed tones. Mr. Hughes, who delivered post and gossip in equal measure, claimed to have spotted Fielding's muddy shoes the morning after the fete, when the weather had been dry for days. And even quiet Miss Brindle, who rarely commented on anything beyond cat food and wool, muttered something about a woman scorned and then refused to elaborate. Miss Marple said very little. She listened, she nodded, and when asked her opinion, she simply said, "It's a great pity and best not spoken of now." But within her the patterns continued to emerge, not just of murder, but of human vulnerability. Lavinia, proud and self-contained, had feared exposure more than justice. She had lived with her late husband's debts for years, guarding her independence with the fierce privacy of a woman accustomed to fragile control. When Terence Adams threatened to stir the murk of that past, she had acted not with violence, but with desperate cunning. Her mistake had been to involve another. Douglas Fielding had loved her quietly, perhaps foolishly. In defending her, he had stepped over a boundary he could never return from. That he came forward in the end, unprompted, was his only salvation, though the law would still decide what price he must pay. On Friday, the gate was finally repaired properly. Not by the council, nor by the church, but by young Peter Lockhart, who lived down on Chisole Lane. He had brought along his tools, a bright new latch, and a determination to make it sturdier than it's ever been. He said he was tired of it banging in the wind like a ghost trying to get out. Miss Marple passed by just as he was packing up. "It's a fine bit of work, Peter," she said kindly. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I'm hoping it'll stay shut now, no matter what." She looked at the gate, freshly painted and gleaming in the sun, then at the boy's earnest face. "It may," she said, "though some things are meant to swing open when the time comes." That evening, as twilight softened the village into purples and gray blues, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, a shawl drawn around her shoulders and her cat purring on the windowsill. The roses outside had begun to fade. She did not feel triumphant, nor vindicated, only quiet. So many of the world's wounds, she thought, were invisible. They whispered instead of bled. Shame, fear, loneliness, these things drove people more strongly than greed or envy ever could. In Lavinia's case, it had been all three, stitched together beneath a corset of decency. Miss Marple did not judge her. She pitied her. She poured one last cup of tea. From her window, she could just make out the garden gate. It was still, closed, but the wind would come again. It always did. Chapter 6, it was nearly a week after Douglas Fielding's confession, and the village of St. Bede's had begun, tentatively, to resume its routines. The grocer's delivery boy whistled again as he rode past the post office. The bell at St. Bede's church tolled out its morning hymn. Even the gossip had softened into something resembling reflection. But Miss Marple, in her quiet way, was unsettled. Something had not quite fit. Not at the time of Douglas's confession, nor in the subsequent days. It wasn't a glaring inconsistency, nothing obvious, nothing one could point to without seeming pernickety. But for Miss Marple, whose entire understanding of human nature was built on nuance and contradiction, it was enough to warrant pause. She was thinking of the envelope. Not the one found in the rosebed, the one with the bloodied corner and the damning note. That had been accounted for, but a second envelope. The one mentioned briefly by Mrs. Weatherby during their walk the morning after the fete. He had something else in his hand, she had said, her voice airy with gossip. A pale blue envelope, looked like it came from a woman. Miss Marple remembered that phrase now with startling clarity. A pale blue envelope. She had not thought much of it at the time. But now, as the village declared itself healed and the final stitch was placed in the narrative of Terence Adams' death, she began to wonder why that detail had vanished. It had not been recovered by the police, nor had it been found on Terence's body. The note in the garden had been cream-colored and unsigned. A pale blue envelope had no place in the tale, unless, of course, someone had removed it. That morning she made her way to the churchyard. The air was damp with last night's rain, and the grass clung to her walking shoes. Miss Marple moved. Slowly, not simply because of age, but because her thoughts required careful pacing. At the edge of the cemetery wall stood Mrs. Weatherby, as Miss Marple suspected she might. She was carrying her usual wire basket, empty save for a bunch of dahlias from her garden. "Miss Marple," she called brightly, "out for a turn?" Just stretching my legs, Miss Marple replied with a smile. And you, my dear, still tending the altar flowers so faithfully. Well, someone must, now that Lavinia's gone off. I dare say I could do worse than a little walk and a bit of color on the vicar's table. They walked together to the chapel door. Inside, the nave was cool and quiet. Dust motes floated like incense in the beams of light from the stained glass windows. Mrs. Weatherby knelt to arrange the flowers. Miss Marple sat in the front pew, pretending to fuss with a dropped glove. "Tell me again," she said casually, "about the morning you saw Terence. Just before he passed." Mrs. Weatherby paused, a dahlia stem poised between her fingers. "Oh, well, I was walking back from feeding Mrs. Pratt's cat. She's been staying with her sister in Surrey, you know. I took the footpath behind the vicarage and saw Mr. Adams coming up from the far side of the green. Carrying something? Yes, 2 things. A biscuit tin under one arm and an envelope blue, I think, in the other. Looked like one of those scented notes some women send." "Silly things," Miss Marple nodded. "And you're quite sure about the color?" "Certainly. I remember thinking it stood out against his dark coat." "And you didn't mention it to the inspector?" "Oh, I did," Mrs. Weatherby said quickly. "But I expect it didn't seem important. He was more concerned about the donation tin." Miss Marple smiled politely, but inside her thoughts churned. The note had vanished, and it had been a distinctly feminine shade-pale blue, scented, and deliberately kept out of the official record, which begged a delicate question. Why had Douglas Fielding not mentioned it in his confession? He had spoken clearly, calmly, even remorsefully. But nowhere had he mentioned a second note. He had claimed to confront Terence over a blackmail attempt involving Lavinia, and that he had lashed out in a moment of misplaced gallantry. It was plausible, even sympathetic, but it was no longer complete. Miss Marple's next call was on Inspector Crisp. She found him in his temporary office in the back of the police post, sleeves rolled up, spectacles balanced low on his nose, poring over a stack of reports with the solemnity of a headmaster marking term papers. He greeted her with the weariness of a man who had not slept well in days. "Miss Marple," he said, standing quickly, "please do sit. I'd offer tea, but we're dry at the moment." "I shan't stay long," she said, "only a small curiosity." Crisp narrowed his eyes. "Curiosity?" "Yes," she said sweetly. "Concerning envelopes." He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" There was a second note pail. Blue, seen by Mrs. Weatherby shortly before Mr. Adams's death. "It was never recovered nor mentioned in your evidence log. I wonder, was it misplaced? Or taken?" Crisp leaned back slowly. He did not look surprised, only troubled. "I remember Mrs. Weatherby's statement," he said finally. "At the time we dismissed it. The cream note in the rose bed, aligned with Mr. Fielding's account. It seemed the more likely item of interest. And now?" He drummed his fingers on the desk. "Now, I wonder, we never found a pale blue envelope. Nor did Mr. Fielding acknowledge it. I assumed." She was mistaken. "Mrs. Weatherby may embellish, but she rarely invents," Miss Marple said gently. "It troubles me, Inspector. If Douglas was telling the whole truth, he'd have no reason to omit the note. But if he was shielding someone—" Crisp's brow furrowed. "Lavinia, perhaps, or perhaps someone else. Someone we have not yet considered." That night Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, the rhythmic clack of needles ticking like a metronome. She thought again of Douglas's expression as he had been led away sad, certainly, but not shattered, not like a man whose world had truly ended, more like one who had struck a bargain with guilt. The pale blue envelope lingered in her thoughts like smoke. A woman's hand, writing in scented paper. A confrontation that ended in death, but perhaps not as Douglas claimed. And still, one detail continued to trouble her, the timing. Terence Adams had been seen shortly after 8:30. His body had been discovered just after 10. But in that span, something had shifted. The garden gate had been opened, then closed. The note had vanished. The blood trail had led away from the vicarage, not toward it. Miss Marple paused in her knitting, the blood trail. Dear me, she said aloud. Outside, the wind had picked up again, the garden gate creaked once, then fell still. The next morning, a fine mist hung over the roofs of St. Bede's like a reluctant veil, softening the outlines of cottages, hedges, and chimney pots. The garden gate at the vicarage, now repaired, oiled, and quietly obedient, no longer creaked in protest. But in Miss Marple's mind it remained ajar, beckoning. She sat in her parlor with a clean notebook open on her lap. Few people would. Imagine the neat, lace-framed room shelves lined with hymnals and small porcelain birds was the theater for a murder reconstruction. Yet in her mind's eye the village was laid out precisely, like a board of chess. She sketched the timeline again. 8:15 a.m., Terence Adams seen walking past the vicarage by Mrs. Weatherby, carrying a biscuit tin and a pale blue envelope. 8:40 a.m., gate heard creaking open by Bertie Lane, the newspaper boy. 9:15 a.m., Miss Hartley. The spinster with the barometer obsession hears raised voices across the green. She believes it to be an argument. 9:30 a.m., Terence. Adams's body is discovered by young Elsie Pike in the garden behind the vicarage. 10 a.m., police arrive. The cream note is found in the rose bed. Later that day, Douglas Fielding confesses to the murder. Miss Marple underlined two things, the envelope and the blood trail. She had asked Inspector Crisp to review the blood pattern again. She knew what she remembered, muddy footprints trailing away from the body, not toward it. In any rational setting that suggested the victim had walked into the garden wounded. But Douglas had claimed to strike him in the garden near the rose trellis, so why, then, the blood spatter at the gate? Why not near the trellis itself? Unless Terence Adams had arrived already wounded, or had been wounded somewhere else. Miss Marple tapped her pencil thoughtfully against her wrist. Could Douglas Fielding have confessed to a crime he had not committed? She needed eyes and ears. Fortunately, Miss Marple had cultivated a generous flock of both over the years. That afternoon she invited Miss Caroline Hartley for tea, a woman not known for warmth, but whose memory was keener than her barometer and twice as changeable. Caroline arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, her wool gloves damp from the mist, and her skirt pressed with the sharpness of military issue. "Barometer's dropping," she said as she entered, without so much as a good afternoon. "Storm before morning." "I thought as much," Miss Marple replied kindly, gesturing to the armchair by the fire. They talked first about weather, then about starching linens. Miss Hartley held strong opinions, and only then delicately about the fate and the murder that followed. "I was just thinking," Miss Marple said casually as she handed a second cup of tea, "how curious it is that we all assumed the shouting that morning came from the vicarage." Miss Hartley stiffened. "Well, it did, didn't it?" "Did it? You heard it from your upstairs window?" "I did, just after 8:30. 2 men, very agitated, but not shouting like common folk. More, how shall I say, heated, but controlled. Tension, not vulgarity." "And you're quite sure of the direction?" Miss Hartley paused, then frowned. "I suppose, now that you say it, I was looking toward the vicarage. But sound is tricky in fog." "Very tricky," Miss Marple agreed. "It's odd, isn't it, how often our eyes tell our ears what to believe?" Miss Hartley sniffed but didn't argue. Miss Marple smiled to herself. It was not much, but it cracked the certainty she needed. The argument may not have happened near the vicarage at all, which opened the field wide again. Who else could have argued with Terence Adams that morning? At dusk, she visited the one person in the village who had remained almost unnervingly silent throughout the affair. Lavinia West, the vicar's daughter, opened the door herself, her face pale but composed. She wore no makeup and her hair had lost the tidy sheen of days past. But she stood straight, unflinching. "I thought you might come," she said softly. Miss Marple smiled. "May I?" Lavinia stepped aside, and the older woman entered the same drawing-room where so many conversations had begun. It was different now. Flowers had wilted in their vases. A copy of the Psalter lay closed and untouched on the table. The air had the faint, sour scent of lavender gone stale. "I imagine this has been difficult," Miss Marple said gently. Lavinia gave a small, bitter laugh. Difficult doesn't quite describe it. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple asked, "Do you believe Douglas did it?" Lavinia hesitated. "He confessed, didn't he?" "Confessions can be given, sometimes as acts of love or sacrifice." A beat passed. Lavinia stared into her lap, then whispered, "You think he's lying?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that the truth has layers, and that perhaps Douglas peeled back only the outer one." Lavinia did not speak. Her hands trembled slightly, then stilled. Miss Marple continued gently. "There was a second letter, pale blue. Seen by Mrs. Weatherby, never recovered." Lavinia's head lifted sharply. Her eyes flicked once toward the mantelpiece, then away. It was the smallest of gestures, but enough for Miss Marple to follow her gaze. There, tucked behind a small clock, was a folded corner of blue. Lavinia followed her eyes. "Please don't." "I won't take it," Miss Marple said calmly. "But I believe that letter might explain more than Douglas ever did." Lavinia stood, took the letter gently, and held it with both hands. "He wasn't going to blackmail me," she said at last. "Not really. He wanted me to leave Douglas. Said he'd tell the village we'd had an affair before the engagement. That he'd show them the letters I'd written." "Did you reply?" "Yes, one last time I told him to stop. That I loved Douglas. That I'd never loved him. And that letter? He never opened it. I found it in his coat pocket when Douglas after it happened. I took it before the police arrived." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then it doesn't incriminate you?" Lavinia's voice was raw. "No, but it does suggest motive, doesn't it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "For someone?" They sat for a moment longer. Then Miss Marple stood. "I believe we are very close to the truth, my dear." "Closer than we've been since that dreadful morning." Lavinia asked quietly, "Do you think Douglas did it?" Miss Marple looked out the window. "I think Douglas believes someone had to pay. And he chose himself." That evening, Inspector Crisp arrived at Miss Marple's cottage unannounced, his face grim. "You were right," he said without preamble. "The blood trail begins outside the garden. I checked the photos again. The drops lead in, not out. And the cream envelope has no fingerprints, none, as though someone wore gloves or wiped it clean." Miss Marple nodded. "It is not over, Inspector." "No," he agreed. "It's only just begun." In her parlor, Miss Marple opened her notebook to a fresh page. At the top she wrote, "Motive means mistake." Beneath it she wrote a single name and underlined it once. Chapter 7. The garden was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves stirred by an occasional breeze that whispered through the hedgerows surrounding the vicarage. The morning sunlight sifted down in gentle shafts, glinting on dew-dappled grass and the fresh paint of the newly fixed garden gate. Miss Marple stood just inside, her gaze fixed on the shadows along the pathway where Terence Adams had met his end. There was something about the pattern of the hedge that caught her eye, a subtle disruption in the otherwise neat trim, a slight indentation as though someone had recently brushed against the foliage or slipped behind it in haste. The sort of detail most would overlook, but one that hinted at hidden movements. She knelt carefully and touched the leaves, noting a faint trace of soil displaced beneath the branches. It was enough to suggest that the hedge, usually an impenetrable barrier, had served as a secret passage. The thought stirred her curiosity anew. Earlier that week, during her conversations with Inspector Crisp and villagers alike, Miss Marple had sensed the underlying tensions not yet voiced aloud. The confession by Douglas Fielding had seemingly closed the case, but the inconsistencies nagged at her, the mysterious pale blue envelope, the unusual blood pattern, and now this subtle disturbance in the hedge. She rose and retraced her steps. Along the narrow footpath that skirted the vicarage, eyes scanning for further signs. Her mind sifted through the timeline, piecing together fragments of overheard arguments, furtive glances, and the hidden histories of St. Bede's residents. The hedge was more than a boundary, it was a witness. Later that afternoon she paid a visit to young Elsie Pike, the village girl who had discovered the body. Elsie was sitting on the low wall of her family's garden, her hands folded tightly, in her lap, eyes downcast. "Hello, Elsie," Miss Marple said gently. "I wonder if I might trouble you with some questions about that morning." Elsie glanced up, then nodded. "Did you see anything unusual in the garden? Perhaps someone moving near the hedge or the gate?" Elsie hesitated, then whispered, "I thought I saw someone behind the hedge, but I wasn't sure. They were moving quickly and I couldn't see their face. It was just before I found Mr. Adams." "Did they come through the gate or slip past the hedge?" "Past the hedge?" Miss Marple asked. Elsie thought for a moment. "I think they came through the hedge. There was a gap like someone had pushed through the branches." Miss Marple's lips twitched with a knowing smile. "Thank you, Elsie. You've been very helpful." That evening, Miss Marple met with Inspector Crisp to share her observations. "There's a pattern," she explained. "A way the hedge was used as a secret entrance or exit. Someone who knew the garden well could use it to move unseen." Crisp frowned. "I had no idea the hedge could be breached." "It's not obvious," she said. "But those small things often hold the key. The blood trail also suggests movement through the garden that doesn't fit the story told so far." He nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think someone other than Douglas was involved?" "It's quite possible," Miss Marple replied. "Douglas may have confessed out of loyalty or guilt, but he might not be the whole story." Crisp sighed. "It complicates things." "Indeed," she said with a small smile. "But I rather like complications." The next morning, Miss Marple visited the home of Gerald Beckwith, the local historian and one of the few villagers who had kept a cautious distance from the unfolding drama. She found him in his study, surrounded by shelves of dusty books and scattered notes. "Miss Marple," he said, standing to greet her, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I'm investigating the movements around the vicarage garden," she said, "particularly the use of the hedge." Gerald's eyes narrowed slightly. "The hedge? I hadn't thought it of much interest. Yet it appears someone found a way to use it as a secret path." Gerald paced to the window, looking out at the sprawling garden beyond. "It would be difficult," he mused, "but not impossible." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "You've lived here long enough to know the garden's secrets," she said quietly. He paused. "Yes," he admitted. "I know the garden well. Do you know if anyone else does? Someone with a reason to move unseen?" Gerald looked away, his fingers tightening on the windowsill. "That's a difficult question," he said finally. "I suppose there are a few who know the hedge well, such as—" He hesitated, then said, "Lavinia West. She's lived here longer than most." Miss Marple nodded. "She's been in the shadows of this mystery long enough," she said. "I'm beginning to think the answer lies there." Returning home, Miss Marple found her thoughts swirling around the puzzle pieces she'd gathered, the pale blue envelope, the unusual blood trail, the secret path through the hedge, and Lavinia West's deep connection to the garden. She realized the garden gate was a metaphor, not just a physical barrier, but the boundary between appearances and truths, between what was seen and what was concealed. That night, as rain pattered gently against the windows, she sat by the fire and penned a letter to Inspector Crisp outlining her suspicions and requesting a renewed search of the hedge and garden grounds. There were still stories hidden in the foliage, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover them. The following morning dawned with a taut stillness, as if the village of St. Bede's were collectively holding its breath. The air smelled faintly of wet earth after a midnight rain, and a mist hung over the meadows like a half-remembered dream. Miss Marple, however, was very much awake. She had slept poorly, her mind circling round the final threads of the mystery, looping back again and again to the hedge, the blood pattern, and most of all, Lavinia West. She stood at her bedroom window, watching the day begin. Below, the little churchyard was quiet. The gate that had once creaked ajar now stood stiff and motionless. Repaired and freshly painted, perhaps a symbol, she thought wryly, of how people liked to tidy things once they were no longer dangerous. But the danger wasn't gone, not yet. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had made her way purposefully, but not hurriedly, to the old briars. Lavinia West's residence on the far end of the village green. It was a lovely cottage, wisteria-clad and orderly, but it had always struck her as too perfect, too composed. Like Lavinia herself? The widow received her with her usual polished calm, offering tea on a lace cloth in the drawing-room. Everything was in its place. Silver shone. Flowers, cut just that morning, stood obediently in a vase. I confess I was surprised by your note, Miss Marple, Lavinia said as she poured. Is this a social call, or does it concern the dreadful business at the vicarage? Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, I wouldn't dream of intruding socially without warning. No, I do have a few thoughts loose ends, as it were. I find I can't rest until they're neatly tied. Lavinia inclined her head, lips pursed. You've always had a fondness for neatness, haven't you? Not so much neatness, Miss Marple replied, stirring her tea delicately, as completion. I dislike patterns left unfinished. Speaking of which, I've been thinking a great deal about gardens. Lavinia's spoon paused mid-stir. Gardens? Yes, particularly the one behind the vicarage. You know, well, I believe? A slight pause. I've been there, yes. For church teas, fundraisers. Miss Marple nodded. You would know, then, how thick the hedgerow is behind the east end, just near where poor Terence was found. Lavinia's smile thinned. Is this going somewhere, Miss Marple? Oh, I do hope so, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. You see, someone used that hedge slipped through it, in fact. There's a gap, small but recently made. The sort of passage someone might use to escape notice, or perhaps enter unnoticed. And I wondered who, other than the gardener and the vicar, might know such a thing. Lavinia set her teacup down too forcefully. If you're suggesting I had anything to do with that man's death— Oh, no, no, Miss Marple said. Quickly, merely that you might have observed something. A rustle, perhaps, a figure slipping away. I saw no one, Lavinia said stiffly. Curious, said Miss Marple, her eyes never leaving Lavinia's face. Because someone did. There was a sharp intake of breath, but Lavinia said nothing. Miss Marple continued. A young girl saw a figure fleeing through the hedge. Not clearly, not enough to identify. But she did notice something, a scarf, pale blue in color. And that, dear Lavinia, reminded me of something else entirely. Lavinia's hand twitched almost imperceptibly. You see, Miss Marple went on, a pale blue envelope was found near the body. The same color, interestingly, as the notepaper you use. You wrote to me once about the Women's Guild subscription, you may remember. Lavender ink on pale blue paper. Distinctive. Lavinia was silent, frozen like porcelain. And now, Miss Marple said gently, I wonder if the letter was meant. F.O.R. Terence. If you asked him to meet you in the garden that morning. Lavinia stood abruptly. You're making dangerous insinuations. Miss Marple remained seated, unruffled. I've always found, she said, that when people are frightened, they begin to tidy away evidence too quickly. It rarely works. You were seen going into the vicarage garden days before the murder. You and Terence had a heated conversation. Someone overheard. I dare say it was about something unpleasant. Lavinia's voice, when it came, was low and tight. He was blackmailing me. Miss Marple tilted her head, inviting more. Lavinia sat again, her composure slowly crumbling. My late husband, she began, was not the man people thought he was. There were debts, affairs, one of them with a woman Terence later knew. She'd written letters, stupid, sentimental things, and Terence somehow got hold of them after her death. He threatened to reveal everything unless I paid him. And you refused, at first. But then he threatened to show them to the bishop. I couldn't bear the disgrace. I met him that morning to reason with him, to offer something. If he'd leave me alone? Her eyes were bright with anger now. But he laughed. Said I'd pay for my husband's sins or suffer. I lost control. I had a trowel in my gardening bag. I didn't even think. She covered her face. I struck him. I didn't know I'd killed him at first. He staggered, fell. I ran. And Douglas Fielding? Miss Marple asked. Gently. He must have found him later. He saw the blood, the papers, perhaps guessed what had happened. He came to me that night. Said he'd take the blame if I insisted. He was always loyal, always in love with me." "Foolish boy." Miss Marple looked down at her tea. "And you let him confess?" "I begged him not to, but he insisted. He thought he was protecting me." There was silence between them, thick and still. "You understand I must go to." "The inspector?" Miss Marple said finally. Lavinia nodded, broken. "Yes, I understand." That evening Miss Marple met with Inspector Crisp once more. She relayed the entire confession, sparing Lavinia's most painful admissions, but leaving no doubt as to her guilt. Crisp was quiet for a long time. "It's always the ones you least suspect," he said finally. Miss Marple nodded, eyes distant. "It's never that simple," she replied. "We see what people present to the world, their neat gardens, their lace doilies, their calm smiles. But there's always something behind the hedge, Inspector, always. Always." Chapter 8 The church bells of St. Bede's rang faintly in the distance, echoing across the village like the soft chime of memory. It had been 2 days since Lavinia West's quiet arrest. There had been no dramatic scene, just a carriage from the county constabulary, a dignified woman with gloved hands and a fixed expression, and Inspector Crisp escorting her down the garden path with more courtesy than custody. St. Bede's reacted, of course in its usual way, with teacups and astonishment. "That poor woman," cried Mrs. Toller, the baker's wife. "To think she was capable of such a thing." "She always was too composed, if you ask me," muttered old Mr. Hemmings, who hadn't liked Lavinia since she'd turned down his application to lead the flower committee in '47. "It's the quiet ones," proclaimed Mrs. Pendle in the grocer's queue. "Mark my words, it's always the quiet ones." And while the villagers mourned the scandal, adjusted their gossip accordingly, and reset their social alliances like pieces on a chessboard, Miss Marple sat by her hearth in her little cottage, knitting calmly and reflecting not on justice, which had been served, but on the deeper, more elusive fabric of human nature. She was not inclined to dramatize. One did what one must. Inspector Crisp came to see her the next morning, hat in hand, eyes weary. "She confessed in full," he said after she'd poured his tea. "No legal wrangling." "No effort to defend?" "Herself. Just sat there, hands folded, and told the story like she was reciting a Sunday psalm." Miss Marple nodded gently. She had very little left to protect in the end. Her reputation, yes, but that was already bleeding at the edges. Her guilt had nowhere else to hide. Crisp exhaled through his nose. "It's a terrible thing to take a life." "It is," Miss Marple agreed. "And a worse thing, sometimes, to live with having taken one." Crisp sipped his tea in silence. "Still, you were right. About the letter, the hedge, the scarf, all of it." "Oh, not all of it," Miss Marple said mildly. "There were moments I quite doubted myself. But there's something very particular about rage in a tidy person, Inspector. When one builds a life on order and appearances, a single drop of chaos can turn the whole thing to storm." He looked at her with quiet admiration. "Never understood how you do it, Miss Marple. No fingerprints, no weapon recovered. No forensic wizardry, just tea and conversations." She gave a thin smile. "Well, you see, people do love to talk. And they nearly always reveal themselves when they think they aren't being listened to." He chuckled. "Remind me never to play cards with you." "I should like that very much," she said. "I do enjoy a quiet hand of whist." That afternoon she took her usual walk through the village, stopping now and then to chat politely, to inquire about the widow's rheumatism or young Arthur Pendle's progress at school. The trees rustled in the summer wind and children skipped. Pebbles by the stream. The vicarage garden had already been cordoned off, the blood long cleaned, the lawn trimmed again as if nothing had happened. But the gate, the notorious garden gate, now hung firmly shut, newly repaired and properly latched. It made Miss Marple oddly sad. There had been something telling about that broken gate, always ajar, as though waiting for someone to slip through. Now it stood correct and silent, an illusion of safety restored. Douglas Fielding, out on the vicarage path, caught sight of her and raised a hand. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly as she approached, "for seeing the truth, even when I clouded it." Miss Marple studied his face. "The lines were deeper now." The boyishness had gone, replaced by a weary sort of wisdom. "I don't believe you meant to deceive, Mr. Fielding," she said. "You meant to protect. That's quite a different thing." He looked down. "I loved her, always, even when I knew I shouldn't." "Yes," she said. "I did know." He smiled faintly. "You always do." They stood a moment in silence, the breeze shifting lightly between them. "I've decided to leave St. Bede's," he said. "There's a posting in Northumberland. A small village, much like this one, quiet, simple." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes a fresh beginning is a form of repentance." He nodded his thanks and walked away, leaving Miss Marple to the soft hum of summer birds and rustling hedges. Back in her cottage that evening, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, a letter half finished before her. It was addressed to her nephew Raymond in London. "My dear Raymond, you will be pleased to hear that I have once again stumbled into the midst of an unfortunate affair, though, as usual, I cannot say I went looking for it. It is strange how murder often visits the places most unsuited. For it, I sometimes think evil rather enjoys the incongruity of a rosebush and a secret." She paused, pen held lightly in hand, then added, "Do tell Joyce that I'm well, and that the chrysanthemums came up beautifully this year. Perhaps next time you visit we can go walking by the stream again. But do remind her not to lean too. Far over the edge, there's a very curious eddy just past the bend, and you know how water remembers things we wish it wouldn't." She smiled to herself, sealed the envelope, and placed it neatly in the outgoing post tray. Outside, the church bell tolled 7. The village of St. Bede's began settling into its gentle rhythms once more. Children called in for supper, curtains drawn shut, the hush of twilight descending like a well-worn blanket. And at the edge of the green, the garden gate, once the passage to violence and secrets, stood closed at last. Properly fastened, silent, Miss Marple looked out at it through her lace curtains, knitting once again in her lap, a simple pattern. Moss stitch. Predictable and quiet. But her eyes behind her spectacles remained as sharp as ever, because peace, after all, was a fragile thing, and murder, like love, always found a way through the hedges. The end Miss Marple and the garden gate that never closed.